I'm your host, Vincent Rodriguez, and today we're going to go ahead and start by talking about Ashton Jeanty. Now, why are we talking about Ashton Jeanty? Well, obviously, as I just explained, I'm a fan of the Boise State Broncos. I've been a fan for almost a decade now, plus. And within the past 5 years or so, my fandom kind of really grew to going to more games and everything like that. So I've actually had the pleasure of seeing Ashton Jeanty play in person at least 3 or 4 times. Basically one of the best players in our school's history, just behind Kellen Moore. But unlike Kellen, Ashton's gunning to be a top 10 pick in the league. And so also as a Chargers fan, my buddy sent me a graphic that showed me the different teams interviewing at the combine. So we're just going to talk about all the different teams and the one that didn't, although, they're going to eventually, and we'll just get started from there. So to start, with Ashton being a top 10 pick, basically, by many projections, he's gotten a lot of draft comparisons to LaDainian Tomlinson. And I can kind of see where that goes because, I mean, a knock against Ashton is the competition he played against in the Mountain West Conference. But, people forget that LT 25 years ago basically played in the exact same conference. Because before the Mountain West was formed, there was the WAC conference, the Western Athletic Conference. And pretty much most of the teams that are in the Mountain West now were in the WAC, just plus or minus a few teams. Like TCU was back in the WAC back in the day. So LT basically played against most of the same competition, and he did pretty much fine in the NFL. But I will say the LT comparisons, I can see them from that aspect, but I think LT is a little bit more of a better athlete than Ashton is, just simply because when you kind of look at their running styles, LT was been more of a slasher one cut type of running back. He could, take a cut through the hole and just bounce out and run all the way down the field. And Ashton is kind of more of a contact type of runner. He's going to get hit first and then break through the tackle as opposed to like juke the guy. That's not to fit. That's not to say he can do that. We've seen him juke plenty of guys in open space, but not necessarily when he's going through the hole past the O line. So there's that. LT is a little bit of a better catcher too than Ashton is right now currently. So I would think the better comparison, and there'll be reasons why later in the video about this, but the better comparison would probably be more Frank Gore, because Frank Gore was a little bit of a slower runner, and Ashton's not as fast as LT. I'll be surprised if he runs. I mean, he did run like 22 miles an hour on certain runs, but I don't think he's as fast as LT. So, and he's not as slow as Frank Gore either. Frank Gore ran something like a 4.5 something at the combine. So, actually have it right here. So, and, as far as measurables are concerned, they add up pretty well. So if you look at Frank Gore when he measured in, he was 5'9" and 217. And right now, Ashton unofficially is measured at 5'9", 215. And Frank Gore ran a 4.58 at the combine. Ashton's not that slow. I'm sure he's at least a 4.5 guy. And supposedly LT ran a 4.46. So I would say Jeanty would probably run more in the 4.65 maybe about at that. But he's not as slow as Frank Gore. But as far as their running styles are concerned, they're very, very similar. If you watch kind of their highlights, Frank Gore was that type of back who would kind of run through the line, break a couple tackles right at the line of scrimmage, and then burst out for a run after that. And that's pretty much Ashton Jeanty to a T. I think the Frank Gore had a bit of an advantage, and Michael Robinson mentioned this in his podcast with Marshawn Lynch, is that Frank Gore was just such a intelligent runner. Like, he could see the holes right as he was running. So, that's something Ashton, I'm sure, kind of has a little bit. It's kind of hard to tell considering, the Boise State O-line was pretty good at run blocking. But, there would be times against lower competition he didn't really have to pick a hole. He could just pick any hole he wanted. So we're going to see how that translates over to the NFL. But I could see Ashton being that kind of similar runner where he kind of sees the holes where he wants to hit. And if somebody meets him at the line, he's going to at least chug forward for another 2 yards and break that tackle. So we just started with the draft comparisons right there. And then we're going to move on to some of the teams that have been reported to interview him at the combine. But we're going to start with the one that didn't, that everybody's talking about, the Dallas Cowboys. Now, on first glance, the Cowboys not taking Ashton at an interview at the combine seems a little weird, considering that basically it seems like a match made in heaven. Jeanty has made it very clear on a couple of his live streams that he's done on YouTube. When asked about it, he said, "Man, it'd be a dream come true to play for the Cowboys," and that makes sense considering that he didn't grow up in Frisco like some reports have been saying. He played high school football in Frisco. He actually grew up in Jacksonville before his family moved overseas because of his dad being in the Navy or a Marine, as it were. Either way, so he played high school football in Frisco, basically at the Star. So that's kind of where that connection comes from. And that's also the reason why they're not interviewing him at the combine because, it was basically asked, of the team. And they basically said, oh, we're going to have a local Frisco pro day soon. So they're going to have all the time in the world. And they're going to invite him, obviously. So they're going to have all the time in the world to work him out, get his measurables, interview him when they have him there at the pro day. So that's why they're not, using one of their limited combine interview roster spots or whatever on him. They're just going to do him at the pro day. So definitely still keep an eye on the Cowboys taking Jeanty, at least in most ways, because it seems like obvious slam dunk. Jerry Jones likes to have his guys who want to be Cowboys, and you need a running game to help Dak out. Considering you trotted out Rico Dowdle out there last season, and he did serviceable, but you can't pass up a player of Ashton's talent. You hired Brian Schottenheimer, who you know came from the Pete Carroll coaching tree of run the ball, run the ball, run the ball. And of course, his dad was Marty Schottenheimer, who made Marty Ball famous. So yeah, they're gonna want to run the football. And I'm pretty sure Jerry Jones kind of feels a little bit of regret from the last superstar athlete that he passed up that wanted to be a Cowboy in Randy Moss, and I'm sure that still haunts him to this day. So passing up on Ashton Jeanty, a person who wants to be a Cowboy, especially at a time when the Cowboys are kind of seen as, not necessarily the most respected franchise because of their choking and all the circus that happens with Jerry Jones. So a guy who actually wants to come to Dallas, he's going to take that opportunity. But, when we look at the Cowboys, you have to remember that there's a lot of interesting things that go on with the Cowboys. Because beyond that, you also have Zach Martin retiring, which is going to make a big hole in that right guard or left guard at the guard spot right there. So you're going to have to replace that. And, the cast of characters on the O-line isn't exactly the most inspiring right now for the Cowboys. They still have a couple rookies in there, and they have the tackle guard they took out of Tulsa. So, the interior O-line isn't exactly the best. And then, so there's that. And then also, too, you have to remember that, over the past, well, we saw it more when Kellen Moore was an offensive coordinator, that they would be taking guys from Boise almost every other year or every year or so. When Kellen was the OC, you had Leighton Vander Esch, you had DeMarcus Lawrence, you had Cedric Wilson, Darian Thompson was there at safety for a point. So now that Kellen's gone, was that more of Kellen's doing, or was that more of Jerry Jones, actually wanting those players, or Jerry and Stephen Jones more aptly? But then again, you can make the argument that, Jerry Jones likes Kellen so much that, Kellen would probably tell him on the way out, hey, take a look at Ashton Jeanty. I think he'd be a good fit here in Dallas. Although we'll get to the Saints eventually because they were one of the teams that also interviewed at the combine. And then, we kind of have to look at the kind of draft picks that the Cowboys have taken recently. I just mentioned Leighton Vander Esch and the guard out of Tulsa, and then you also have players like, Zach Martin and Travis Frederick. They were taken, and everybody was looking at the Cowboys like, you taking a guard and a center in the first round, and then they just drafted Mozzie Smith last year. So the Cowboys are nothing if a little unconventional when it comes to their drafting. Now, not as unconventional as the Seahawks have been over the past couple years, and we'll talk about Pete Carroll when we get to the Raiders. But so that's just another thing to look out for. And that's also the kind of thing is like you kind of notice that the Cowboys kind of draft about a year out for their needs. They kind of drafted they kind of drafted O-line a year before they needed to draft O-line, so to say. So they kind of like to plan ahead a little bit with the drafts they take. They all in the first round, they usually try to take a guy that's either going to plug and play right away or is such a good talent to eventually replace somebody that they're going to let go next year. So, you can make the argument Ashton kind of fits in that mold if they're going to let Rico Dowdle go. But then, you have, CD Lamb, and then you have uh, Trayvon Diggs, who are good cornerstones for the team, but, who's to say how much longer they're going to want to stay in Dallas. So, possibly you could draft a wide receiver or a corner up ahead to pair with them for now, and then eventually, let them out the pasture in a year or two. So we'll see what happens with the Cowboys. But I mean, it would be a very good fit. Plus, you have, I mentioned CD. You have CD running those routes, taking pressure off Ashton, so he's not facing, 7, 8, 9-man boxes. So that's with the Cowboys. So keep an eye on that. They're gonna definitely have him at their Frisco Pro Day. So, he's still one to watch. And, I'll just leave it off with the fact that, while everybody's penciling it together, and I say this every single time somebody brings it together, I do not want Ashton to go to the Cowboys. That may be the team he wants to go to, but just for his long-term career, I don't want to see that happen. Because if you look at the last two great running backs that the Cowboys have had in DeMarco Murray and Ezekiel Elliott, they just ran those guys fully into the ground. And then they went off and basically just kind of were average or stuck it up with the teams afterwards. DeMarco Murray had that great season with Tony Romo, led the league in rushing, and basically got them all the way to the NFC Championship game. Then not only a couple years later, he gets shipped off to the Eagles, doesn't do the best there, and then ends up going to the Titans and doesn't do the best there, and pretty much out of the league from that point. And then Zeke had that great rookie year with Dak, and then ended up in a few years going to the Patriots and looking like a shell of his former self. Now, you could argue that might be conditioning, but either way, shows a pattern that the Cowboys are going to just take their running backs and give them carry after carry after carry after carry. Isn't exactly the best for a guy like Ashton who just got done having a full college season of that. So I just don't want to see, my favorite player from my favorite college of all time, ended up on a team like the Jaguars in 5 years or something because he's got no legs left and the Cowboys just constantly pounding him into the ground. And so with that being said, we're going to move on to the teams who actually had been reported to have official interviews with Ashton at the Combine. And we're going to start with the Raiders. Now, the Raiders at 6 make a lot of sense. I mean, it's only about, a spot higher than the Falcons took Bijan Robinson a few years ago. And that pick turned out relatively well for them. It hasn't really translated to the most team success, but that can be blamed more on the idiocy of Arthur Smith and the subsequent idiocy of Raheem Morris in that front office signing Kirk Cousins and not turning to Michael Penix until, late in the season. So, Bijan has been worth that pick alone, just even though it hasn't really translated to the team's success. He hasn't been the reason why the Falcons have not won a lot of games. Let's just put it that way. But so Raiders are in prime position at 6 to take a running back, even though they might need a quarterback. And, a lot of this always shakes out on how the draft plays. Who's to say where Shedeur was going to go? I mean, they're going to take, if Shedeur is there at 6, they're going to take Shedeur. I mean, all the pieces are right there. Connection between him and Tom Brady, Shedeur being a flashy player, getting more eyes in Vegas, that whole market. Going to happen if the draft falls that way. But if not, I could completely see the Raiders taking Ashton at 6. You got Pete Carroll, Mr. Run the ball, except for that one time in the Super Bowl. But, it's predicated all on the running game. So I could see that completely happening. And then you have the influence of Tom Brady. And Tom Brady, better than anybody, should know how a great run game can help out his quarterback. I mean, look at his years in New England and those few years in Tampa. He had playoff Lenny. He had Ronald Jones, Corey Dillon, Ben Jarvis, Green Ellis, LeGarrette Blount, who would be the most apt comparison to Ashton, ironically enough. And then, you have Corey Dillon and Benjarvis Green-Ellis, James White, Kevin Falk, all those type of great running backs who could carry the load and help, open up the passing game with the threat of the run. So I could totally see Tom Brady kind of with his increased influence on the team, kind of saying like, hey, we need to get a great running back in here, regardless of whoever we have on quarterback. And I think also too, that would kind of show one on this. I think with Pete Carroll there as the coach, you don't really have to worry about quarterback all that much, which sounds ridiculous to say, but I mean, Pete Carroll is the guy who coached Matt Hasselbeck, Charlie Whitehurst, the late Tavares Jackson, Geno Smith, and Russell Wilson. And for one game, Drew Lock against the Eagles, all to decent to winning seasons. So I think Pete Carroll, better than anybody, is the right type of coach to kind of take any quarterback and at least coach them up to at least 7 wins at the very most. So if you have a coach, like that, then you can afford to kind of take a little more risks and take best player available as opposed to reaching for a need. And then you also kind of have to look at, you have Brock Bowers as a great blocking and receiving tight end. You have Jacoby Myers there on the outside. And, recent news has said that Michael Mayers is on the trade block, but if they don't end up trading him, then you have you run 2 tight end sets, both blocking. That opens up all kinds of lanes for Ashton. And, the receiving threat of Mayers, Brock is going to take some of the pressure away from the boxes he might face. And then another aspect, you have to look at is, the hiring of Spy Tech. Now, Spy Tech is coming over from Tampa, and, the immediate connection is, oh, well, he was there during the Tom Brady years. But Spy Tech's been with the Broncos for the Bucks, I think for the better part of a decade now. And so not only was he there as director of player personnel during the Brady years, he was also there when Dirk Cutter was the coach. And for those who don't follow Boise State football, Dirk Cutter has been our on-again, off-again offensive coordinator for the past few years. And, Dirk Cutter at one time was the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So, Spy Tech was there. He was there when Cutter was the head coach. And he was also there when they drafted Doug Martin, another Boise State product running back, who, despite having a pretty short career, only lasting about 5-6 seasons, still had 2 seasons of over 1,400 yards in between a couple of injury-plagued seasons. So I think Spy Tech knows better than anybody, like how Cutter coaches up their guys and, to kind of look beyond the competition and see a good player when he knows a good player, draft a better version of Doug Martin, who you've seen the coach that Ashton played for up close and personal. There's a pretty good connection there. But you kind of have to look at some of the, you pair Pete Carroll with Ashton Jeanty and have him coach up Ashton to be Beast Mode 2.0, and you've got a recipe for success right there, regardless of who's a quarterback. You could take a quarterback later in the draft, take a developmental guy, Milroe, Dart, Kyle McCord, Riley Leonard. I think if he's in the pool this year, somebody like that to kind of just coach up and manage behind some, quick veteran starter. Hello, Russell Wilson. That would be hilarious. Mr. Corny himself reuniting with Pete Carroll in the glitz and glamour of Vegas. But, we shall see. But then again, you kind of have to look into these different factors too, is that the Raiders do not have a good interior O-line. I mean, they're decent at guard because they drafted Powers Johnson last year, and they have Colton Miller at tackle. But other than that, the rest of their offensive line is entirely in question. So that's not exactly the best, for a pretty straightforward runner. Ashton does have the speed, and he's shown it many, many times that he's a far better runner bouncing to the outside than he is going interior. But, so we'll see what Pete Carroll does with that. He tended to run beast mode a little more up the middle from what I can remember. So you might have to adapt that pretty quickly unless they build up their offensive line really well during free agency and the draft. And on the subject of Pete Carroll, you kind of have to think back to the Seattle days and kind of think, were those weird first-round draft picks Carroll or were they John Snyder? The L.J. Collier, the Jordan Brooks, and Rashad Penny. And I love Rashad Penny. Don't get me wrong, but first round was a little high to draft him, and he didn't really do a lot in Seattle, and then ended up going to the Eagles and didn't really do anything either. So that's another. So if that was a Carroll move, then we have no idea who the Raiders are going to take at 6, or they might even trade down. Well, we don't even know what happens with that. So we'll see if that was more Snyder's doing or Carroll's doing as far as the weird first round draft picks were concerned. And also on Carroll too, you kind of have to look at his history of pretty much taking any running back from anywhere and turning them into at least a decent starter for a year or two. I mean, you look at, a couple of the undrafted free agents at running back they had during his time in Seattle, like Chris Carson, Thomas Rawls. And at second round guys, you had Zach Charbonnet and you had Alex Collins, the late Alex Collins. And so pretty much, you don't really necessarily have to give Pete Carroll first round talent for him to turn a guy into a starter. Knowing that, you kind of pass on Ashton and take a guy in the later rounds, maybe like Scadaboo or something like that, and see what he turns into that. And if you're fine with running into the year with Alex Madison and Zamir White, and I love Alex Madison, another Boise State guy, but he's a decent runner at the very least. So if you run with those two, and then just take a chance on Pete Carroll finding another undrafted gem, you can do that. And then you also have to think about too the influence that Chip Kelly might have as the new offensive coordinator. Now, given his time with the Eagles as a GM, it kind of seems ridiculous to say, but I mean, he is coming from a national championship winning program in Ohio State, and Ohio State has at least 4 prospects rated in the top 50 for the draft, 3 of them at least potential first rounders. Um, because recently, it was Josh Simmons who recently came back with some injury concerns that kind of kicked him out of the first round. So, but you have Emeka Egbuka, you have Donovan Jackson, and you have Trayvon Henderson, all potential first rounders. And, with the team as kind of talent starved, really, mostly on the offense, you could see, Chip Kelly kind of wanting one of his guys to kind of help jumpstart the offense and kind of bring the Ohio State offense into the NFL. And, you pair Emeka Egbuka with Jacoby Myers, and now you got a dynamic receiving duo. Or you shore up that offensive line with, Donovan Jackson, either at guard or tackle. And maybe, Trayvon Henderson or his running partner, his name escapes me, but they have a later round running back also out of Ohio State. Maybe he wants a guy like that to kind of fit the style of offense more. So, maybe they end up passing on Ashton at 6. And then, and another interesting thing too is with the comments recently that Mark Davis made about still thinking that John Gruden was entirely screwed out of his NFL job. That's a discussion for a whole other time, but that bears noting, at least for the simple fact that, John Gruden's kind of had a resurgence of popularity online, with Barstool Sports and everything like that. And one of the most recent things was him thanking Ashton Jeanty for turning him onto listening to Migos, of all things. So, if John Gruden and Mark Davis kind of still have that pretty, really close connection, it's fair to ask, whether John Gruden is kind of passing along things over to Mark Davis, kind of saying like, hey, you should draft this kid. Maybe he reminds him of old running backs from his Tampa days or whatever else. So that's kind of a fair thing to think about. And, kind of funnily enough, despite not having any immediate connection that I could find, John Gruden and Pete Carroll, that thing kind of goes together too, because, they're both kind of goofy head coaches. So, you kind of look at John Gruden having that Migos moment with Ashton Jeanty, and then you remember back to the draft when Carroll drafted DK Metcalf and they had the whole shirtless handshake and everything like that. So I could totally see, Pete Carroll looking at that Migos thing with John Gruden and kind of be like, oh, I kind of want to recreate a funny moment like that. And that kind of seems ridiculous a little bit to say, but when you're, coming into a team like the Raiders who have just been desperate for any kind of positivity and kind of like to stay in the headlines, trying to at least, with, being in the Vegas market, I could see Pete Carroll being like, hey, I can get a great player in Ashton Jeanty, and we create another funny moment like I did with DK, and kind of, capture the headlines, make a great story, and kind of, bring this kind of fun player culture into the Raiders like he had it with the Seahawks. Who knows? We might see it happen. Then we'll go on to the Vikings. Now, the Vikings are at 24 right now, but I've seen mock drafts have Ashton going as late as the Broncos, down at number 20. So I guess it's entirely possible depending on how the draft shakes out. But so, there are teams that have done interviews with Ashton other than the Vikings, kind of like the Chargers, the Steelers, the Ravens, the Broncos, Bengals, all, past, 15, which you would think would be the latest Ashton would go. You could say doing due diligence, or you could say, it's possible that some of these teams might want to trade up for him if he falls past the Cowboys at 12, or even the Colts at 14, who did an interview with him. But so let's take a look at the Vikings. So you got KOC, right? And KOC was with the Redskins at the time from 2017 to 2019. You had Jay Gruden as the head coach. And Jay Gruden is just another branch off of the Mike Shanahan tree for the most part, in some ways. Now, initially, when I was doing some of my research into this, I kind of was hesitant to kind of put Ashton with any kind of McVay, Shanahan disciples, simply because, my limited knowledge, and I am not a football expert by any means, but my limited knowledge of the Mike Shanahan run scheme was it was very kind of zone gap oriented. And I didn't really kind of see Ashton as that type of runner. Because when I think of zone gap, I think more like one cut, quick type of guys, Quinn Portis, Terrell Davis, Alfred Morris for a time. But I did a little bit more research, or at least digging, and I read one article, to be honest with you, that kind of mentioned that the branching off of the Mike Shanahan tree from guys like McVay and Jay Gruden and Mike McDaniel and all the others, they kind of run more gap schemes more than the traditional zone run that Mike Shanahan used to run. So in a gap scheme, I could completely see Ashton being great in that kind of scheme. So, that's why I feel a little better about talking about guys like KOC, and the Vikings, taking Ashton. But, so that's kind of where that influence comes from. And I mean, I mentioned that, KOC's time with the Redskins because, in his last two stops, Redskins and Rams, he saw better than anybody what a great running game can do for your team. I mean, when he was with the Redskins at the time, they had a decrepit old Adrian Peterson run for 1,042 yards one season, and then 898. You know how bad your running game has to be to make over 30-year-old AP at that point look that great? And they were running, and before that, they had Samaje Perine and Robert Kelly running the ball. So, yeah, I think KOC knows what a good running back can do for your team. And then when he was at the Rams, even more, because, when he was in the Rams in 20 and 21, they drafted Cam Akers in the first round, and Cam Akers had a pretty decent rookie season. And then they were going to lean on him during the Super Bowl run in 21. Then he got injured, and then they've just plucked Sony Michel out of nowhere and ended up making it all the way to the Super Bowl, just based on Sony Michel alone. So I think with that, KOC knows the run game is pretty important. That's why he got, Aaron Jones this past season. And Aaron Jones did really good. He ran for at least 1,100 yards. And so, but he's a free agent this season, and he's kind of getting on the back burner of his career. So they kind of see him as more of a rotational back, if anything, if they do bring him back. So, you pair Aaron Jones with Ashton Jeanty, Aaron Jones being a little bit better of a receiver, you got a great duo right there. And I mean, if they're carrying Aaron Jones to 1,100 yards, the interior of the Vikings isn't exactly the best, but they do have Garrett Bradbury at center. So that's a great improvement right there. C.J. Ham has shown himself to be one of the better fullbacks in the league, so you got him paving the way for Ashton there. And, it makes sense for an AFC North type of pick too, because, I mean, Ashton played in Boise State, in the cold weather and everything. So, you can go into Chicago and you can go into Green Bay and, keep your running game going. And even better advantage if you have a big running back like that who can break tackles, which you're playing in the domes, in Minnesota and Detroit. And, assuming this year they actually do go full steam ahead with the plan of drafting J.J. McCarthy, what better weapon to pair with your, rookie quarterback than a dynamic running back who can take the load off of him and kind of, let the rookie develop at his own pace. And, J.J. McCarthy kind of used to that, coming from Michigan with Donovan Edwards and Blake Corum. So you kind of put him more at home there, kind of having a running game to lean on. We know J.J. McCarthy doesn't have the best arm, even though he did show, the ability to throw deep during the preseason. So you kind of have that short passing game, keep defenses honest. You're basically pairing Ashton with his college quarterback, Matson, who basically was kind of like the same type of player who could hit short passes and then occasionally hit the deep ball. I mean, it seems like a great match made in heaven there. Then we're going to stay in the NFC North and go on to the Bears. Obvious is obvious. You have a great quarterback in Caleb Williams who can also run the ball occasionally when he needs to. You got Ben Johnson now, who just came from the Lions, who have the dynamic duo of Sonic and Knuckles and David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. So you get your David Montgomery type who can just plow and run down tackles. And you pair him with a guy like Roshan Johnson, who might be a better athlete, or you go find, a guy in free agency who's a little more athletic and a little more speedy and can catch out of the backfield. And you basically got Sonic and Knuckles right there ready for the taking to kind of help you hopefully at least do better in the NFC North this year. And then you got Rome Odunze at the new receiver going deep, and pretty sure they're not going to re-sign Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen's made it known that he wants to go back to L.A. But if by some miracle they decide to keep him in, Chicago, you got the route runner Keenan Allen who can also run, crossing routes across the field, kind of take some of the pressure off of Ashton there. Cole Kmet being one of the better tight ends in the league as far as, catching and blocking is concerned. So, he's set up for success there. The biggest issue is going to be their O-line. The Bears O-line is terrible. They only got one good starter at tackle in Darnell White, or Wright, as it were. And then the rest is all complete question mark. They might go into the season with 4 new starters on the O-line potentially if they end up finding anybody that they like. So it's not exactly the best situation to be going in with the Bears, but it makes sense. And the Bears are at 10, that right end of the sweet spot that they could still potentially take him at 10 and have success there. So, we'll go with that. Now we're going to go to the Saints. Now, again, another obvious is obvious. The Saints just hired Kellen Moore, Mr. Boise State himself. And Kellen Moore just came over from the Eagles, who won the Super Bowl with a very dynamic running game. He was with the Cowboys during Dak's rookie year and Zeke's great run there in Dallas. The only knock against him in the running game was his time with Chargers for, whatever reason, be it Brandon Staley's incompetence or the fact that he didn't really have the great weapons to kind of work with as far as the running game was concerned. Austin Eckler's a great running back, but he's more of a kind of smaller receiving back. He could run up the middle too, but, it wasn't exactly a dynamic weapon like, Zeke or Saquon Barkley. So, of course he's going to, with his first head coaching job, if he has the chance to go dip into the pool of his alma mater and take basically the best prospect they've had, he's going to do it. And, you kind of look at the Saints being at number 9 right ahead of the Bears. If Ashton makes it past the Giants and the Raiders, he's there for the taking at number 9 for the Saints. And, kind of leaning back on the, his time with the Cowboys, he saw how a great running game works there, and Saints have a decent-ish O-line, I would have to think, for the most part. You got, Cesar Weiss at center. Pretty much the only I didn't do a lot of research in the Saints O-line, I'm gonna be honest with you. I knew they had Andreas Pete, went somewhere else last season, so I'm not sure what they have at the O-line, but I mean, hey, I mean, they did it well enough, so, we'll see with that. But, the best part about taking Ashton is you pair him with Alvin Kamara. Kinda similar style of runners as far as the balance is concerned, because we've seen Kamara take a hit and completely stay upright the entire time and just keep running on down the field. I've seen Ashton do that a couple of times last season. But the best part about that is that, one of the weaknesses in Ashton's game is his passing is receiving, because he wasn't really asked to do that too much at Boise State. Alvin Kamara is one of the best receiving backs in the game. So you pair them together, have Kamara take Ashton on the jugs machine and teach him a few things about catching and running some routes, and, you've turned Ashton from an already 3-down player to an even better 3-down player. And you get to have your replacement for Kamara when, the wheels fully fall off. He's fallen off a little bit, but, he hasn't had that big crash yet. And, I think Kellen, more than anything, will be very motivated to make his running game work as a head coach, because he made it work in Dallas. He made it work in Philly. He couldn't make it work with the Chargers. And I think he's going to be really motivated to kind of show that Chargers thing was a fluke. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to, make a good offensive go when you have one of the best O-lines in the game at the time with Dallas, and again with the Eagles. So he's going to be, taking a dynamic weapon in Ashton and trying to make him work with a below average O-line in the Saints. And if he can make that running game work, then it kind of shows that he doesn't necessarily need like the perfect situation to make his running game develop. Now, that's not to say he's not going to get help with a dynamic running back, again, like he had with Zeke and Saquon, but still, I mean, at least you're showing he's putting something into it instead of just getting lucky like he did it with those other two teams. And in the, weak NFC South, any tiny advantage you can take in that division is going to help the Saints out, especially when you're gunning against, Baker Mayfield with the Bucs and, the rise of Michael Penix and the Falcons. You get a superstar running back there to help out Derek Carr, who kind of really had to do it mostly himself last season, let's be honest there. And, take the load off of him. And, speaking of Derek Carr, it's kind of ridiculous to say, but, with the draft being basically the NFL's version of silly season, shout out to Eric Estep and the Off the Wall NASCAR show for coining that term for the NASCAR season. But, any little stupid little thing is going to connect teams to a player somehow or whatever else, or convince the team to get the certain player. And Ashton Jeanty has not been shy. In fact, the whole Boise State team hasn't been shy about their Christian faith. Ashton's been quoted as saying that he thinks of himself as a Christian disguised as an all-American running back. And Derek Carr is another kind of outspoken-ish Christian for the most part on the Saints. So that kind of be a good pairing too, to kind of add those two together and, make Ashton a little more comfortable in that environment, so to say. And another kind of ridiculous thing to point out, but, why not, is the Saints have Spencer Rattler on the team. And Spencer Rattler is close friends with one of Ashton's former teammates in C.J. Tiller. C.J. Tiller was the quarterback who played for Boise State when they were in the S.L.A. Bowl versus UCLA. And he ended up getting that role because Matson was hurt at the time, and because Taylon Green had just entered the transfer portal. And, CJ and Spencer are really, really close friends. So I'm sure CJ is probably telling, Spencer all about how great of a, not only how great of a player Ashton is, but also, what a great person and teammate he is. And, it kind of seems ridiculous to say that, a 5th-round rookie and Spencer Rattler would have any sort of movement on the needle, but, whatever little bit helps, and, any little bit to kind of help Kellen make the case to Mickey Loomis to say, this is the guy that I wanted. You need to draft him. It was going to help. And, kind of figure that Kellen Moore has time to make this a full-on rebuild, considering they gave him, a 4 or 5-year contract. So you start by building out the run game first, kind of let Carr do his thing until you can get his ridiculous cap off the books, and then take a brand new quarterback to develop with Ashton. And, at least having Carr there would assure that Ashton wouldn't have to necessarily take the entire load on himself like he did just this past year. So you need to keep him relatively freshest for your brand new rookie quarterback in a couple years or so. So, I'm sure Kellen's probably keeping all that in mind when thinking about going back to his roots there. Now, the more interesting team that took an interview with Ashton is the Giants. Now, the Giants are a lot more complicated now after the news that came out that Matthew Stafford is staying with the Rams. If Stafford had gone to the Giants, I would say slam dunk, go ahead and put this down as Ashton probably a 3, even though that might have been really, really rich. But you pair Matthew Stafford with Ashton Jeanty, woo, that'll get you some great wins right there. Because, I don't think Matthew Stafford has ever been paired with the running back of Ashton Jeanty's caliber. So that would have been a great thing to see. But alas, that's not going to happen. And so a lot of it really depends on how the draft falls and how secure Dable and Shane are in their jobs. Because that's really going to determine how the Giants play number 3. Because if Shane and Dable are on the hot seat and they need to make this year work, and they don't get a veteran quarterback like, hello, Aaron Rodgers, hello, Russell Wilson, maybe even Gardner Minshew, that'd be hilarious. But if they don't end up getting a veteran quarterback and they're going to go in the draft and they're desperate, assuming Shador and Cam don't go 1-2, whichever one is left at 3, the Giants are going to take. No questions asked about it. Now the interesting part comes in if they're relatively secure. If they still have another 2-3 seasons left in them, then I could see the Giants trading down from 3 if either Shador or Cam are left on the board at 3 and they don't have anything to worry about. Because the way I'm thinking about this is that Cam and Shador are not necessarily slam dunk quarterback picks. They're just seen at the top of the draft because they're pretty much the best out of a pretty weak draft class. So if Shane and Dable are secure enough in their position to where they're going to last another season or 2, I think if they look and they have the pick of Shador or Cam at 3, I think they might just trade back to whoever wants one of those guys. Maybe the Raiders want to trade up to get him, or somebody else. They got a haul, trade back down to maybe as low as, I don't know. So let's say the Raiders. So they go down to 6. They get that haul there. They get Ashton Jeanty at 6. And then they take a developmental guy like Jackson Dart in the 2nd round. Or they use the picks they got from the Raiders to trade up till the tail end of the 1st and take a guy like Jackson Dart, who was seen as kind of like the 3rd quarterback in this draft class. So then at that point, you get your dynamic weapon in Jeanty, you get your developmental guy in Jackson Dart, and Shane and Dable are still around enough to kind of see how that development plays out. Now, again, that's all ridiculous conjecture and everything like that. And, I'm sure a lot of Giants fans wouldn't exactly be happy about passing up Cam Ward or Shador at 3 if they were there. But I mean, you kind of got to look at it a little bit more of a long-term type of thing. I mean, the Giants aren't going to be better anytime soon. So if you have the chance to add more draft picks and build your roster more, that's pretty much how we've seen a lot of terrible teams slowly start to get better. It's just building their assets up. And it wouldn't necessarily be a kind of a bad thing. I mean, obviously the elephant in the room of why even Giants would even, take that interview is because of Saquon. I mean, they just saw their old running back completely dominate the league. So, pretty much be ridiculous to kind of not at least take an interview with who's seen as the top running back prospect in the draft. You know, Mara's an idiot, so of course that makes sense. I mean, the optics are already bad on Shane, Mara, and everybody else for letting Saquon walk. So, could you imagine if they didn't interview Ashton? To kind of be like, well, what the hell are you doing? New York media is ridiculous and will jump on anything to kind of slander. So, that makes sense there. And I'm sure Dable is kind of looking at the team right now and kind of remembering his days back with the Bills where they had no running game at all to pair with Josh Allen. So, if Dable does have those 2 extra years to kind of stick around, he's like, okay, we couldn't find a running game with the Bills, so I'm going to build my running game now with Ashton Jeanty and then find my quarterback later. And, you have Tyron Tracy who came on the scene last season, so that's a good kind of pairing right there. And you got Malik Neighbors to take the top off of defenses. So, a lot of the teams that Ashton goes to kind of need to have a little bit of some type of receiving threat just to make sure he's not constantly facing 7, 8 boxes like he did in college. So a guy like Neighbors is really going to help out with that. Now we go on to the pair of AFC North teams, the Steelers and the Ravens. Both of those obvious type of things. The Steelers with their hard-nosed culture and the Ravens with their dynamic running attack. So we'll start with the Steelers first. Again, obvious is obvious. It's the Steelers. They're all about pounding the ball and running the ball and hard-nosed, tough culture. Najee Harris has been a disappointment for the team, to say the least. I mean, he's been a good running back, but he hasn't been the weapon that they thought he would be when they took him in the first round a few years ago. So you got a guy like Ashton in there, plug and play with that decent-ish interior O-line and everything for the running game at least. And, you got yourself a brand new weapon on offense right there. And then, you just saw your rivals, the Ravens, completely take over the league only behind the Eagles, your in-state rivals, with Derrick Henry completely plow through the AFC, and the Eagles completely plowing through the NFC with a dynamic running game. So, you want to build your running game, with that for whoever the hell you have a quarterback next season. And I mean, it makes even more sense if they decide to keep Justin Fields around. With Justin Fields being an athlete himself, that the quarterback position being able to run really well. So you kind of keep defenses honest, running some RPOs or pistols or something like that. And you got Justin Fields either running down the sideline or you got Ashton Jeanty bursting up the middle and bouncing outside. And, you open up a new dynamic to the offense that you haven't really had at all because, Big Ben in his declining years wasn't really mobile. And Big Ben was kind of more of a scrambler and more of a pocket maneuver person than the quarterback than he was like an actual mobile running quarterback. And the last time the Steelers had an actual athlete at quarterback was Cordell Stewart. So you pair Fields and Ashton together, you open up your offense that way to, keep the defenses honest with the running game and then, chuck it on downfield to Mr. Cancer himself, George Pickens. And then hopefully Roman Wilson coming back into the season, hopefully healthy. And then you got, Pat Freiermuth there was a great blocking and receiving tight end. And then you got Connor Hayward, their fullback, and you compare Ashton with Jaylen Warren, who's come onto the scene the past couple seasons and is a great athlete at running back. So you kind of get your own little version of Sonic and Knuckles up there in Pittsburgh. And also too, you keep him out of the Ravens' hands, hopefully. Just a few picks ahead of the Ravens. And, you have to pray that the Bengals don't take him at 17, keep him out of that division. Speaking of the Ravens, so now we're going to move on to the Ravens. So again, you take basically light Derrick Henry and pair him with the real Derrick Henry and have Derrick Henry teach him a thing or two. And you pretty much assured your run game for hopefully the next decade. I mean, and could you imagine Ashton Jeanty, Derrick Henry, and Lamar Jackson running the old 2-back RPO that Harbaugh's brother used to run with the 49ers? Good luck stopping that. and even running out of the pistol too with Lamar Jackson and Henry and Jeanty. For as great as the running game was last season, even more dynamic. And at least at the very least, if Derrick Henry needs a spell, you can plug in Ashton and keep going, no problem. And on top of that, you have Keon Mitchell, the speedster running back there to kind of add another weapon there to the dynamic. You can have Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, and Ashton Jeanty in a shared backfield and have Keon Mitchell split out wide in the slot. Or you could do the three-back pistol and have, Henry or Jeanty as fullback position, have Keon Mitchell, on the side as a quick pitch out option and have either Derrick Henry or Jeanty, directly behind Lamar Jackson getting a full head of steam. Whoo-wee, that would be you're going to run into old freaking service academy offenses with that kind of backfield. And the Ravens have some decent-ish receivers to kind of keep defenses honest there to make sure you're not facing loaded boxes, everything. And you have Patrick Ricard as well, who can, stay on the line as like a fullback tight end or, in the traditional fullback backfield, all 300 pounds of him. Good luck stopping that. And the Ravens obviously have a great run blocking O-line, so that helps even more. Then you got Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely at tight end. Mark Andrews being a great blocking tight end. Receiving kind of a little iffy there near the end, unfortunately, against the Bills. But Isaiah Likely coming up on the scene and being a great dynamic weapon at tight end there, at least, making those great catches. One toe not included. And then another little interesting connection is Todd Monken. Now, Todd Monken's coming over from Georgia. Georgia usually always pumps out great running backs and have the past couple years. So, Monken knows better than anybody how important a run game is and how great running backs can help out the team. But another interesting little connection is Todd Monken was actually an OC back in Tampa under Dirk Cutter. Again, Dirk Cutter being Boise State's offensive coordinator past couple seasons and had Monken on his staff as OC when he was head coach in Tampa. So I'm sure Dirk Cutter is kind of talking to his old offensive coordinator, with the Ravens and kind of letting him know, like, this kid's special. If you have a chance to take him, you might want to take him. That could completely, and, the Ravens have not been shy about trading up for people that they like. They traded up for Lamar Jackson. So, you see Ashton fall past the Cowboys and the Colts possibly. I could totally see the Ravens trading up to go grab him. And we'll go with the Bengals as the next team we're going to discuss to kind of round out the AFC North. Bengals make a ton of sense. They're at 17, so they would be in prime position, assuming the Colts, who we'll talk about in a sec, and the Cowboys pass on him. Now, the Bengals kind of do and kind of don't need a superstar running back because they've been doing just fine with Joe Mixon, who, arguably probably would have been taken in the first round, when he was drafted if he didn't have any of those character issues that came, along with him. But, no matter what, Zach Taylor and his running back coach, Justin Hill, know how to create a running game. Because in the entire time Zach Taylor's been there, and the past couple seasons when Justin Hill's been there as the running back coach, Joe Mixon has run for at least 4,000-yard seasons, one of them being over 1,200, which was when the year they made the Super Bowl versus the Rams. And in one season where he didn't play all 16 games, he still ran for 800 yards. And then, most recently they got Chase Brown to at least 1,000 yards. I think it was like 990 or something like that. So they know how to make a running game, and they've made it work with, a pretty above average running back in Joe Mixon. So, taking a player of Ashton Jeanty's caliber with their ability to kind of create a good dynamic running game, you finally have a good, reliable backfield you can lean on so Joe Burrow doesn't have to constantly play Superman the entire time and, have every game be a shootout. Now you're able to actually control the clock and take methodical drives down the field as opposed to just trying to take a shot every time with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, who was recently franchise tagged, assuming they keep him around and don't tag and trade him. So, you have those two kind of taking, attention away from the defense so they can't load the box against Ashton Jeanty. And, in the rare times where Joe Burrow decides to run, probably throw in some type of quarterback keeper read option type of play just to kind of get Joe a run out there in space, kind of make defenses kind of think about that. Wouldn't happen a lot, obviously, because you really wouldn't want to run Joe Burrow with his injury history so far. But it's just a play here and there they can throw in, if they need a last minute first down or something like that. And it's definitely going to help their defense if they get a good running game. Now, you know, to be determined whether the awfulness of the defense was just because mainly of personnel or also because they had to be on the field for so long. Either way, hopefully they're going to pick up some good free agent additions and draft some good guys after Ashton in the first round if they take him. And then having Ashton be able to kind of wear down defenses and control the clock means your defense gets more rest on the sideline. So, hopefully they don't wear down as fast or look as atrocious as they did this past season. The biggest issue is going to be the weak O-line of the Bengals. I mean, they released Alex Kappa this week. So their interior and the O-line in general is pretty bad at this point. So they're going to run into maybe anywhere from 3 to 5 potential new starters. Unless you hit on that interior, or at least you hit on one of the tackles, then, having Ashton, who's kind of more of between the tackles type of runner, but can also bounce side when he needs to. If you don't have a good tackle there to kind of seal that edge to allow him to get outside, one-on-one stiff arm a guy or something, they're pretty much going to, waste him the whole time, and he's going to be in the backfield immediately if they don't fix that offensive line. Now we go on to the Colts. And the Colts are an interesting one as well, simply because they're still relatively new. Shane Steichen's only going to enter his third season this year because he got hired in 2023. But he mainly got hired for his work with the Eagles in creating, before this past season, one of the best running games in the league when Philly went to the Super Bowl the first time versus the Chiefs. Steichen was the main architect in that. That's why he got hired in Indy in the first place. And he did that with Miles Sanders of all running backs. So give him Jeanty, who's to say would be at least on par with Jonathan Taylor right now at this point, because Jonathan Taylor has been a decent running back. He just can't stay healthy. Just this past season, he ran for, I think it was over 1,400 yards because he played all 17 of his games. Playing all the games has been the issue, considering the last 2 seasons. Before this one, he's been in and out of the lineup with injuries. And then, his rookie year, he had a fantastic season. So it doesn't make too much sense to kind of replace Taylor so fast. But, if you truly believe that he's not going to stay healthy, then drafting an insurance plan like Ashton Jeanty, who's, knock on wood, has been shown to be pretty healthy despite, carrying the load for the Boise State offense last season. You have him as an insurance plan in case Taylor continues to break down. Or at the very least, you can, keep them both, kind of let Taylor run out of his rookie contract or whatever. And if he doesn't want to re-sign for, cheap, then you can let him go for Ashton. But in the meantime, you can have them both in the backfield and keep them both relatively fresh. Just kind of rotate them out here and there, and you don't really lose anything, when one or the other's on the field. In fact, it might help out even more because then you avoid the situation they had, Steichen's rookie year where they didn't get into the playoffs because they put Goodson out to catch a pass instead of Taylor, who's, the better receiving back. So if anything, spelling Taylor and having Ashton in there helps you out because then you can keep Taylor on the field for third down passes instead of taking him off when he needs a spell. Now, the interesting part is going to be the O-line, the start, because Ryan Kelly's a free agent this year. And I believe they still have Braden Smith at tackle, but their O-line is still, a decent-sized question mark, so we don't know what's going to happen with that. And then the other thing, too, other than the obvious of, pairing him with AR-15, which makes, all the sense in the world. You pair a 250, 6'4", running athletic quarterback with, bowling ball statue of Ashton Jeanty, and you're going to run over defenses all over in the backfield. And, then Steichen could possibly bring some of the RPO and pistol concepts over from Philly to here, now that he has, like, a good running back who would, you give him a head of steam out of the pistol, and he's gonna, break tackles and bust through the line. But the interesting part is Jim Bob Cooter. Now, obviously, as Steichen being an offensive head coach, he's most likely the main architect of the entire offense. But it's worth noting that Jim Bob Cooter has and hasn't really shown if he's good at making a running game. Because, up until having Jonathan Taylor in his previous stops with Detroit as an OC and then with the Jets as a running back coach, in Detroit, he had Theo Riddick, Keon Johnson, and Zach Zenner, and then, worn down LeGarrette Blount all as his running backs. So with that, they kind of, and, having Stafford there at the time, they kind of lead more towards using the running backs in the passing game more than they did the running game. Theo Riddick being, a great receiving back before he went to the Broncos. And then pretty much the same thing kind of happened in New York. Somehow, despite having Le'Veon Bell completely washed after his year holding out, he managed to get decent production out of Le'Veon Bell. I think like 700 yards and a couple hundred, out of the passing game. Comparing that with the corpse of Frank Gore in his final seasons there. And he still got decent production out of them. Now that he's had Jonathan Taylor as his running back, an actual good above average to borderline elite running back in the league right now. He's gotten him at least 1,400 yards when Taylor stayed healthy. So, who's to say more that either Jim Bob Cooter is good at developing a running game because he hasn't really had the talent, or is he just, riding off the talent alone based off of Jonathan Taylor? We're going to see what happens with that, because if they have Taylor and Jeanty, he's got to find some way to get both those guys on the field at the same time and keep them fresh. So we'll see what Jim Bob Cooter does with that. His past history has shown he's, leaning a little bit more towards backs who can receive and are a little bit quicker. But, we'll see how he adapts with that. And, Steichen being there, I'm sure he's going to have a major hand in crafting that offense and trying to recreate at least part of what Philly did when he was there and they went to the Super Bowl for the first time versus the Chiefs. And, you have AR there to kind of keep defenses honest with his ability to chuck balls all the way down the field, 60 yards on a rope. So hopefully that open things up even more for, Taylor and Ashton to kind of pound down defenses. Then we're going to go on to the pair of AFC teams other than the Raiders, being the Broncos and the Chargers. Now for the Broncos, I'm fine with the Broncos taking Ashton, even just as fine as I would be if the Raiders took Ashton, simply because, my dad is a Broncos fan, and, shout out Brandon Perna. I'd be more than happy to see Ashton go to a fan base as good as the Broncos and with an organization that's run as well as the Broncos, even, with the changeover they've had and the trust and everything like that. Plus the funny meme a little bit of just, another Boise State Bronco going to the Denver Broncos, trading blue and orange for blue and orange. Pair him with, JL Skinner, the safety that they took from Boise State last year. Kind of a little thing and great to root for. Now, the interesting thing is just looking at Sean Payton and what Sean Payton is going to prefer at this stop, because Sean Payton has always been a guy who is more of a two-back, different skill set type of guy. For every kind of strong running back who can run up the middle and break tackles like Pierre Thomas, Mark Ingram, and Chris Ivory, you had the more athletic guys like Darren Sproles, Reggie Bush, and Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara is kind of a hybrid a little bit because he could break tackles and keep his balance very well, but he's kind of, more recognized as a receiving type of back with his great stats out of the backfield. So I guess you can look at it in one way with Javonte Williams not really panning out, because of injury and just not really playing well. And then you have, you kind of more athletic one-cut running back in Jaleel McLaughlin. So you get Ashton as your hammer and you have Jaleel as more your scat running back. That could be the possibility there. But then, recently Sean Payton mentioned kind of wanting to have more of a joker type of athlete. So, hello Taysom Hill, who's a free agent, probably most definitely going to be signed by the Broncos. But even beyond that, I could see a guy like Camp Scatterboo being more of Peyton's type of speed, especially with that performance he put on versus the Texans, where he threw a pass, caught a pass, great catch down the sideline. And then, obviously ran the ball pretty effectively as well, despite having a concussion the whole time and throwing up on the sideline. That's the kind of player I could definitely see Sean Payton wanting to have. He's got to have that versatility more. And the same kind of applies to Joe Lombardi kind of too, as, his forever OC. When Joe Lombardi was with the Chargers in between his time with the Saints and the Broncos, the running game didn't really develop all that well. Joe Lombardi kind of used the running game more as an extension of the passing game with short passes. That's why Austin Eckler became one of the better receiving backs in the league under Joe Lombardi. So, I would venture to guess he might prefer Scatterboo as well, just because of Scatterboo's receiving ability. And then, you have Jaleel McLaughlin there, and you also have Marvin Mims. They've kind of used him in the backfield, so to say, as on like jet sweeps and stuff like that. So I could totally see Scatterboo being the preferred pick for the Broncos if they want to take maybe offensive line or complement to the defense in the first round instead. But with Sean Payton maybe being content with having Jaleel McLaughlin as his number 2, could be looking for his number 1 in Ashton Jeanty. Now we finally go to the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, obviously, as a Chargers fan, I would kill to have Ashton Jeanty on the team. Basically the best player in Boise State history, for the most part, on my favorite team of all time. Sign me up. I'm going to every single training camp from then on. And funnily enough, it fits pretty well with kind of what Harbaugh wants to do, because Harbaugh has clearly wanted to run the ball since he got to L.A., signing J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards and then drafting Kamani Vidal. And Gus Edwards has been mostly a disappointment as kind of the more plodding, downhill, strong running back with injuries in and out and just missing a gear that he used to have, or if he even ever had, down in Baltimore. So, you keep J.K. Dobbins around for a couple more seasons, and then you sign Ashton, and you're good to go from there. J.K.'s kind of shown to kind of be the more athletic running back, and then you keep Ashton as your downhill plotter and break tackles, and then, have J.K. teach him a thing or two. Dude, and you're set for the next decade, possibly, especially with having both of those guys and Scotty Matlock, all 300 pounds of him in the backfield. I mean, you could see a return of the old Kaepernick offense that he ran with the Niners, running 2-back RPOs and pistol formations, having all 3 of those guys in the backfield. I mean, they've shown a propensity to run Herbert every so often. So who's to say you couldn't see Herbert faking a handoff to Jeanty and then running around the corner for 15 yards? Could happen. And another underrated connection that I don't think a lot of people kind of know about or talk about is Frank Gore, which I talked about earlier in part 1 about the kind of draft comparisons to Frank Gore and everything. But Frank Gore has been on record as being Jim Harbaugh's favorite player of all time. They asked him in an interview a few years ago, who was his favorite player to coach, and it was Frank Gore. And, Frank Gore has been also been complimentary to Jim Harbaugh. When Boise State went up to the Bay Area to play San Jose State, Gore was there. He was there on the sideline, meeting with Ashton, talking with Ashton, there in the stands, or staying on the sidelines more rather, to watch him play. So I'm sure after meeting with him, he's even more on Jim Harbaugh's radar, with Frank Gore, talking in Harbaugh's ear, potentially telling him, what a great player and great person Ashton is. Which, it's debated whether or not Harbaugh really cares about character, considering his time at the 49ers. But even still, Frank Gore has been safe for maybe like one accusation, I believe, a while ago when he was with the Colts, I believe it was, or something like that. But anyway, other than that, he's been nothing but squeaky clean. So I'm sure, Harbaugh values that input even more, coming from a high character guy like Frank Gore. And then, with Ashton, Harbaugh would basically be able to fully recreate his backfield in Michigan, having Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards there, Ashton Jeanty and J.K. Dobbins, and, maybe eventually Ashton Jeanty and Kamani Vidal, who showed some flashes during the preseason and the couple games he played during the regular season. So, fingers crossed. We've seen Jeanty mock to the Broncos at 20, so who's to say he couldn't fall a few more spots down to the Chargers? I mean, some mock drafts have Shedeur Sanders falling all the way down to 20. We're going to see what happens with that. But I just want to close it off by saying, thank you, whoever ends up watching this. I just appreciate all your support and any little advice. Whatever little bit you've given me, be it through DMs or whatever else, I just really fully appreciate it all. And I hope that this rambling at least is somewhat entertaining, at least a little bit. And, let me know if you have any advice, any pointers, or whatever else. This isn't really going to be the main style when I hopefully eventually started. It would be more kind of interview oriented. But I just kind of thought it'd be a great opportunity to kind of just put this out there as kind of like a, pre-recording thing and, see how anybody likes it. And then, I've been recording these parts or different takes over the past few weeks. So, there's a few things I probably missed as far as new news is concerned. So, changing situation is ever changing. So we'll see what happens coming up in another month with the draft.